Hello and welcome to our next lesson, which is on Marx. And we're looking at a reading from Marx, the Communist Manifesto. And in the Communist Manifesto, we get this idea from Marx that history is a study of class struggle and oppression between the rich and the poor, master and slave, kings and serfs. So kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture and the broad expanse of history itself, Marx claims that what's really going on in history is continual class warfare. And that's really the kind of driving force behind history. This was not a novel idea from Marx, although many attribute this to Marx as being kind of his idea, a novel idea. Marx was influenced by previous German philosopher Hegel, who also made a similar claim about history. It just so happens that more people attribute this idea to Marx. And he brings this kind of idea about history to the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, he says, has brought the classes of the bourgeois and the proletariat over that of feudal economics. So he says, when looking at history, we can look at the ancient world, which was a slave-based economy. Then he describes later, such as during medieval times, as being like a feudal economic system. And then he says what has replaced that, given the Industrial Revolution, is capitalism. And now we have this system where we also still have class struggle, except this time it's between what he calls the bourgeois and the proletariat. So let's first discuss the bourgeois. And what he means by the bourgeois is the industrial mass production business owners, or in other words, the capitalists. And I'm going to be using capital B as shorthand for business. So the bourgeois are those capitalists who own large factories, for example, and are involved in industrialization and mass production. And what he notes is that with the advent of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, what we see now is that modern government is a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeois, where here BOU is shorthand for bourgeois, and is in fact run by the bourgeois. So he says really underneath it all, what's running government is the bourgeois, given the advent of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And today, for example, we have, 500 companies that have offices in Washington, D.C. with 61,000 lobbyists, right, putting money into the pockets of congressmen and women in order to influence their vote and influence their decision-making. So this observation that Marx makes is still true today, at least to a significant extent, given modern practices. And what we'll generally see with Marx is that a lot of his predictions he made are quite accurate, and he makes some very nice predictions. He has, for a philosopher, he has some very good foresight. However, in regards to other things and other predictions, he does not do very well, and he makes some bad predictions and makes mistakes. But what he says, though, that in a capitalist society, what's going to happen is that property only lies in a few hands, mostly in the bourgeois, right? And there's data out now that's saying that sometime in the near future, the top 1% will have more than the 99% combined. So this was also kind of an apt kind of observation and prediction made by Marx. Marx also said that above all else, the bourgeois value self-interest and see human affairs in terms of cash value. So he says the bourgeois, their kind of psychology, what's going on, their kind of motivation for action is always for self-interest, to try to make as much money as possible and to try to get away with doing bad things, for example, to other people in order to make their money. In large terms, anytime they have any kinds of human interactions with others, such as business partners or people who are working underneath them, or possible future clients or future business partners, they see them in terms of cash value. How much money can this person help me make? What can I get away with? How can I get more out of this person, make more money from this person in some kind of way? So Marx sees capitalists as having this kind of motivation for their actions. And just to give you a picture of the Industrial Revolution, this time period that he's largely writing about. Some standard conditions were having things like a 12 to 14 hour work day. So you had to work 12 to 14 hours. If you didn't, then you would lose your job. So you had to work this much. Women and children, they had to work and try to make ends meet. So the workers were getting paid so less. There was not, for example, minimum wage during this time. So they were being heavily exploited by the bourgeois, or the capitalists, and so they weren't making very much money. So families had to have women as well as children, little children even, work in order to try to make ends meet. And in this society, in this system, women and children made much less than men. It was also allowed to have discipline of children workers where, for example, managers could beat children. There were lots of practices such as having unsafe machinery with daily deaths. And the bourgeois would not try to fix these machines and make them safe because if a worker died, they could just go out onto the street and get another worker. So why invest more money in trying to make safe machines to try to save their workers' lives and make it more safe for their workers when they can save their money and if their workers die, they just pick someone else up off the street to work. Once again, this is in line with Marx's observation about the bourgeois, where he sees them largely as being self-interested. Also, during this time, there were steep fines for talking. So you couldn't, in a lot of places, factories, you could not talk while you worked. Women would give birth at work and continue working the next day to keep their jobs. So there was no time off for women who were pregnant or just had a child. They would keep at it or else they would lose their job. And remember, they needed to keep their jobs in order for their families to make ends meet. Also, there were no Saturdays off, so it was standard for workers to work 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours per day. And also, many children had to work in machines. So during this time in the factory, machines were quite large and bulky. And it's not to say today there aren't factories still like that today, but during that time especially so. And there were cubby holes made in these machines where children, fit for children, small children to get in there. And small children had little hands, so they could stick their hands into places in case there was a jam or something like that going on in the machine, so that way they could fix the machines. And they would spend their workday inside of these machines fixing jams whenever it happened. A lot of time these children would die inside the machines. If there was a problem with the machine broke down or something like that. So these things happened. Okay, so let's next discuss the proletarian. Okay, the proletarian or the proletariat, what Marx means by this is the modern working class. And how he describes them, he says this. He says, they live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the fluctuations of the market. So if you think about it, the proletarians in a capitalist society are kind of dehumanized in a way, he says. He describes them as being kind of like a commodity, kind of like an article of business, and they're treated in that way, right? Not as human beings. What he's saying here, and this goes back to a German philosopher who we looked at, Kant, he says they are used as means to an end and exploited for profit by the bourgeois. So the bourgeois are using them and treating them with unsafe working conditions, very little pay, and trying to exploit them as much as possible to make as much profit as possible. And they're just using them as a means to their own self-interested ends for making financial gains and by the bourgeois. Okay, so next let's discuss this concept alienation from Marx. And what he means by alienation, or how he starts talking about it, he says that proletarians' work, and by capital P, that's shorthand for proletarian, the proletarians' work lacks character and is monotonous as they become appendages of machines. So he notes that the proletarians, Maybe beforehand they were in the countryside working on farms, doing different kinds of jobs depending upon the time of season. For example, maybe working with animals, you know, planting seeds, then harvesting crops, etc., doing different things. And there was, in the Industrial Revolution, a kind of mass exodus of people from the countryside to the city. And when these people were working in these factories, their work had much less diversity to it, and it lacked character and it was monotonous. They were doing the same thing on the factory line, the same monotonous task over and over again, 12 to 14 hours per day. So what he says is, because of this, they become alienated from the products of their labor and from one's human self. What it means to be alienated from the products of their labor and from one's human self is that they no longer are proud of their work because they're just doing this monotonous job, mind-numbing job, over and over again, the same action over and over again. So they're no longer proud of their work. And in that respect, they become alienated from their labor. And what Marx means by being alienated from one's human self is that one no longer is proud of one's own work. So one has, in a way, lost out on a significant aspect of meaning to one's life. So one significant aspect of what provides meaning and significance to our lives is the work that we do. Being proud of our work is very important. Waking up, well, during this time period, 6 days out of the week to do work. It's important for life and adding meaning to life to be proud of one's work. But this is something that is robbed of the proletarians because they're no longer proud of their work. So in a way, they are alienated from their human self because they've lost out on a kind of component of living a meaningful life. And what Marx also knows is that as division of labor increases, the toil for the proletariat increases. The skill required of the proletariat decreases and the pay decreases. So as we have a greater division of labor with the Industrial Revolution, with factory labor, the amount of work the proletariat has to do increases, but the amount of skill required of them decreases, right? Doing the same monotonous jobs, which leads to alienation, right? Alienation from their labor and from their human self. And also what results is also that the pay decreases. And he also notes this kind of vicious cycle that proletarians find themselves in. He says, as soon as they are paid by the bourgeois, they give this money to other bourgeois. For example, landlords and large store owners. So he views landlords and large store owners as being part of the bourgeois class rather than the proletarian class. So they make money from the factory, from factory labor, then they end up having to give all that money back to their landlord as well as to store owners, large store owners, in which case then they have to go to work the next week, right, and end up spending all the rest of their money, again, giving it back to the bourgeois. So it's this kind of vicious cycle of making money from the bourgeois and ending up giving it back to them. Okay, so let's continue with a Marxist critique of capitalism. What he says is that what will happen in capitalist societies is that non-industrialized, small family-owned businesses will perish, and they will become proletarians. So he views family businesses and family business owners as being part of the proletarian rather than the bourgeois class. What he says is that with capitalism is that the factory owners will be able to offer such a competitive, such a great cheap price for their products that this will drive a lot of small family-owned businesses out. And even today we see things like this. For example, when a Walmart opens up in a new small town, that usually spells a death knell for many small family-owned businesses in that small town area because they will not be able to keep up with the cheaper prices offered by Walmart. He also says this, and this objection, criticism of capitalism, you can also learn about it in an Econ 101 class. He says there will be monopolies. What you'll see is that monopolies will form in capitalist societies. You can have one company or maybe just a few companies end up controlling the market, so much so that they drive out competition. And then what happens is that they can then set the price for the product or service, and there is no competition that will lower the price. So one of the advantages of capitalism and one of its virtues is that there's competition. And so with competition between competing companies, you can get lower prices, right? Companies will lower their price to try to attract customers. And this is to the benefit of the consumers. However, what Marx notes is that sometimes that competition becomes eliminated because there are monopolies. And with monopolies, then that will eliminate price competition because there is no more, there's not anymore any real competition. And so then consumers will be paying a high price for the products. What Marx also says is that as the bourgeois continually lower the proletarian's wages for higher profit, the proletarian will form unions. So he believes that there will be a growth in unions, so much so that the proletarians will gain a lot of political power in this way, standing united with other proletarians. And he believes that in the future, the proletarians will become a revolutionary class as it gains more power. And after his death in the early 20th century, unions started winning greater workers' rights, amongst other factors that were in play, and some things started happening, such as having minimum wage. So you cannot get paid lower than this minimum wage. There were also laws put in place, such as having safe working environments, having rules about factories and machines. They have to pass safety regulations and guidelines. There was also things like a standard 40-hour week, and overtime pay afterwards, also compensation for injury on the job. So a lot of these laws started coming in, these kinds of socialist laws getting eventually put in by the government to kind of intervene into the market, to alter the market and the economic system. Okay, so let's discuss some principles of communism. As we can see previously before, communism attempts to be a theory that is a champion of the working class. It really looks out for the poor working class families, blue-collar individuals. But here are some other principles of communism. Communists want to abolish private property. So on this view, there is no private property, but for example, land is owned by the state. Everything is owned by the state, and the state can kind of lend out land for families to live on, but essentially, families do not own private property and private land. Also, for communism, they want labor to lead to the enhancement rather than the subjugation of workers' lives. So no more doing the monotonous job, 12 to 14 hours a day, day in and day out, 6 days out of the week, but rather maybe doing different things, maybe working in different parts of the factory line on different days. Maybe some days doing farm work, some days doing another kind of job. So mixing it up and having kind of a more enhanced experience in labor and in doing your work. They also advocate the elimination of classes, right? So remember, Marx says that history is nothing but the study of, or well, in the big picture, it is the study of class warfare. So he wants to try to get away from this common theme, and he wants to eliminate all classes. There are no classes, no rich, no poor, no bourgeois, no proletarian. And one way to do this, he says, everyone should get paid the same. So even the CEOs, upper management will get paid same as the blue-collar workers. And so this is very different from other political philosophies that advocate differences in pay. Okay, so here are some other ideas. They would like a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. So in a situation, in a non-ideal situation, if you do have people making different amounts of money and there are differences in pay, what Marx advocates for is to have a graduated income tax where there are different tax brackets. those who are more wealthy pay more tax, a higher percentage of tax. Those who make less pay less of a tax. And in our current society, we do have a progressive income tax. He also advocates, and communism generally advocates, the abolition of all rights of inheritance or have significant inheritance tax. So the idea here is to get rid of all rights of inheritance. You cannot, for example, if you make a sum of money and you'd like on your passing, you would like to pass it off to your children, that would not be allowed. But in a non-ideal situation for communists, if there is inheritance, an allowance of inheritance, there would have to be a significant inheritance tax. And why they would like something like this is because they want equal opportunity for children. So children who are born into poor families have less opportunity than children who by luck happen to be born into wealthy families. For example, children born into wealthy families can have significantly many more advantages than children born into poor families, such as maybe going to a private school or getting private music lessons or having a tutor or having maybe a special athletics coach, things like that. Children do not all start on the same starting line at the start of the race that is life. So some children start further behind when the gun shoots off to start the race of life. And it's much more difficult for some children, depending upon what family they're born into, to make it in the world. And the idea behind this kind of significant inheritance tax is try to create greater equal opportunity for those children who happen to not have an inheritance coming their way or are not trust fund kids, etc., to have a more equal shot at life. Also, what an idea of communism, an ideal or principle, is the protection of the environment from capitalist production. So when you picture the Industrial Revolution, you might imagine a scene where you see large factories with black smoke pluming out from those large factories, creating lots of pollution into the air. And so communists want to protect the environment and from this kind of capitalist production, from pollution, etc. All right, so here's some more ideas. One communist idea is to have public schools for all children. So these are state-run, so this is kind of socialized education. So all children who, if you happen to be born into a poor family, you still get an education. So you still have a kind of, so this can help you out, right, in life and reaching your goals later in life. So it's not the case that you're robbed of an education because you happen to be born into a poor family. So all children can receive public education at minimum. Then we have an abolition of children's factory labor. Communists want to have restrictions on children's work, and this was because of the treatment of children in the workforce, getting beaten by the capitalist business owners, as well as placing them in dangerous conditions where they were dying in the workplace. Also, another idea of communism is the intervention of the state for ethics. We cannot have a free market in which there is no government intervention, but we need government intervention to have things like minimum wage and to restrict the bourgeois from creating unsafe working conditions. And things like that, having, for example, antitrust laws to break up monopolies, which is what our society has now today. So the idea from communism is that we need to have the state, kind of a socialist intervention into the marketplace in order to establish ethical grounds. Okay, so here are some objections to Marx. So Marx had many good ideas, but he had a number of bad ideas as well. And we know today that in practice, communism didn't work. Right? There used to be lots of communist societies. Now there are less than a handful of communist societies left. So here are some objections, is that capitalist societies incorporate Marx's ideas, such as having antitrust laws to break up monopolies, having things like minimum wage, restricting the average work week, having laws for safety in the workplace. So what ended up happening was Marx predicted that capitalist societies would eventually disappear. What would eventually happen is that the world would turn into a communist world, a communist society. The proletarians would rise up. The proletarians wouldn't keep taking it, of being exploited. And so there would be this communist revolution, and the world would eventually turn into a communist world. But this did not happen. And one reason why it did not happen is that capitalist societies began incorporating Marxist ideas into their economic and social and political system, which allowed for greater rights to workers. And this helped workers to an extent where many of them did not want to revolt and have a revolution. Marx also failed to see the rise of the middle class. Remember, he views history as kind of a struggle between two opposing classes, the rich and the poor, the bourgeois, the proletariat, the kings, the nobility, and the serfs. However, what we found with a capitalist society is that there was a third class, and it was the middle class, and it was a large class, lots of people in the middle class doing quite well with luxuries and being able to afford luxuries in life and being able to live a comfortable life. And they do not want to revolt, right? They don't want to have a revolution. So he failed to see the rise of this class, which helped provide greater support and stability to capitalist societies, such that there were no revolutions in the way that there were revolutions against feudal economic societies. It very well could happen with a capitalist society, except capitalism helped stave that off by incorporating Marxist ideas. So his prediction of a communist world is false. That the entire world would eventually turn into a communist one, that is false. Also with communism, when everyone gets equal pay, the attempt to eliminate classes and have equal pay, that leads to no incentives, right? That leads to a big problem in the business world, business and economic world, because without the proper incentives, you'll have workers working not as hard, not maximizing and having a high level of efficiency in terms of work output and production. For example, there are communist farms, large communist farms, such as in back in days of communist Russia, for example, that had thousands and thousands of workers. But since each worker was getting paid the same, including the managers, they view themselves as, if I put in a little extra effort, I have to split all that extra effort, any profit that comes that way, with everyone else on the farm, with the thousands and thousands of others. So I'm not going to put in the extra effort. And this was one of the main reasons why these large communist farms went under and could not do well enough to stay afloat.